Hey Nerdinas! So this is the third video in our 4-part series on the internet. So far we've covered the basics of networking, the domain name system, how exactly a domain name is converted to an IP address, and today we are going to be talking about two important commands, nslookup and traceroute. And these commands essentially show us how exactly a computer gets from a domain name to an IP address. The first command is nslookup. So as an example, I would type nslookup nerdina.org. This command would then return the local IP address of my router. So that would most likely be 192.168.1.1. The router, as we know, is then writing the query, which is processed by numerous servers. And then nerdina.org's IP address would be returned. So nslookup would print out both the local IP address of my router and nerdina.org's IP address. The second command that we will be using is called traceroute. Here we can type in either a domain name, nerdina.org, or an IP address, which would be nerdina.org's corresponding IPv4 or IPv6 address. This traceroute not only returns the IP address of nerdina.org and the router, but will also tell us the IP addresses of each and every server that is queried when trying to find the correct corresponding IP address. Just a quick note on terminology. Each time a new IP address is queried, what is called a hop is made. Okay, I have now opened up the terminal. If you're using a Windows computer, the terminal is called the command prompt. So let's type in our first command, nslookup nerdina.org. So we can see over here that nslookup returns first the IP address of our router, also called the server, as it is serving our domain name to the DNS resolver. Next, this address provides additional details about the router. We will discuss this in our specialized video on routers. And now we see that the name nerdina.org maps to the IP address 66.96.132.64. So that is just an idea of how exactly you can find the IP address that maps to any domain name that you type. So now for our second command, traceroute, which, given the domain name nerdina.org, will tell us what servers it went through to map it to the correct corresponding IP address. So just typing this in, traceroute. We now have an option of either using the domain name or the IP address. Let's begin with the domain name. Let's just finish letting it load. Okay, so over here we have the traceroute, and essentially we start out with nerdina.org up here, and then we look at the path that is taken for that domain name to ultimately be translated into an IP address down here. So let's just briefly look at some of the important steps that are taken. First, we begin at the router with the IP address 192.168.1.1. Also note that each time a hop is made, the number of seconds that are spent at each server is recorded. Next, we go to the next common server, seen here. We'll do one more lookup command, and you'll realize that for almost every single domain name that is looked up, this IP address is used. That most likely means that this server is owned by our internet service provider, Verizon. And looking at the next two, you can see that those are also owned by Verizon. And so on and so forth. At one point we make it to Nerdina's hosting account, to Boston, and then finally we get our IP address. Also, one more quick note. Over there for number 6, where you see the 3 stars, there is a limit to the number of seconds that are taken in trying to find a new hop. And there, the system has timed out. However, when it tried again, a new server was found that got us one step closer to finding the correct IP address. Now, let's try one more. Okay, so over here we used google.com, and once again you see the router, this common IP address, most likely owned by Verizon, and then a series of Verizon servers, before finally the IP address of Google is found over here. And one last thing, as I mentioned before, traceroute can be used either with an IP address or a domain name. So if we typed in nerdina.org's IP address right here, we once again here can see the path taken to find nerdina.org's IP address. Now, this brings up one interesting question. Of course, it would take quite a long time if every single time that we typed in a domain name, all of those steps had to be taken just to find the corresponding IP address. Therefore, we have invented the system of cache. Caching allows computers to locally store DNS records and reuse them in the future. This means that if, for example, I have recently queried nerdina.org and a few minutes later I was to query it again, those same records from my previous query could be used, avoiding the need to query each and every individual server and go through all of those hops once again. And this also means that websites are able to load faster. So over here on my browser Chrome, I have opened up a list of the DNS records. So scrolling down, you can see all types of cached records. And some of them, as you can see, have expired, because if every single record and every single domain name that we ever typed was saved, that would take up unnecessarily large amounts of memory. And therefore, just a few recently looked up IP addresses are saved. And therefore, the process in finding exactly the IP address that corresponds to a given domain name is shortened. So this concludes the third part of our 4-part series on the internet and how exactly the internet works. So in this video, we were able to practically look at 2 important commands, nslookup and traceroute. We were also able to briefly discuss how exactly cache is able to speed up the process of the correct IP address for a domain name being found.